Good morning, Keller Rangers. This is like attempt 8 or 9 of trying to read Among the Hidden, chapters 6 through 8 today. So I am currently in the Keller Library. It's very appropriate to read a book in the Keller Library. So first of all, hope you are all safe and sound. And without further ado, chapter 6 of Among the Hidden. The tax bill arrived 2 weeks later, the day that Dad, Matthew, and Mark loaded the hogs onto the livestock trailer and took them all away. Most were going to the slaughterhouse. The ones too young and too small to bring a decent price were going to an auction for feeder pigs. Luke watched through the vent at the front of the house as Dad drove by in the battered pickup with each load. Matthew and Mark sat in the back of the pickup, making sure the trailer stayed hitched right. Even 3 stories up, Luke could see Matthew's hangdog expression. Then, when the 3 of them came into the house for dinner, after washing the last of the hog smell off their hands in the mudroom, Dad handed Mother the tax bill without comment. She put down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew and unfolded the letter. Then she dropped it. Why, that's... She seemed to be doing the math in her head as she bent to retrieve it. That's 3 times what it usually is. There must be a mistake. Dad shook his head grimly. No mistake. I talked to Williker at the auction. The Willikers were the nearest neighbors, with a house 3 miles down the road. Luke always pictured them with monstrous scales and fierce claws because of the number of times he'd been cautioned. You don't want the Willikers to see you. Dad went on. Williker says they raised everyone's taxes because of them fancy houses, make their land worth more. Isn't that good? Luke asked eagerly. It was strange. He should hate the new houses for replacing his woods and forcing him to stay indoors. But he'd half fallen in love with them, having watched every foundation poured, every wooden skeleton of walls and roofs raised to the sky. They were his main entertainment, aside from talking to Mother when she came upstairs for what she called my Luke breaks. Sometimes she pretended his room needed cleaning as badly as the bread needed baking, the garden needed weeding. Sometimes she just sat and talked. Dad was shaking his head in disgust over Luke's question. No, it's only good if we're selling, and we ain't. All it means for us is that the government thinks they can get more money out of us. Matthew was slumped in his chair at the table. How are we going to pay? He asked. That's more than we got for all the hogs, and that was supposed to carry us through for a long time. Dad didn't answer. Even Mark, who normally had a smart alecky comeback for everything, was stupefied. Mother had turned back to her stew. I got my work permit today, she said softly. The factory's hiring. If I get on there, I can maybe get an advance on my paycheck. Luke's jaw dropped. You can't go to work, he said. Who will, he wanted to say, who will stay with me? Who will I talk to all day when everyone else is outside? But that seemed too selfish. Luke looked around. No one else looked surprised by Mother's news. He shut his mouth. Dun, dun, dun. Chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just for the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before the harvest, and Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, all the while pretending, for the sake of the open window, that they'd just forgotten something upstairs. As soon as the rest of his family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents, first out the front, to see Matthew and Mark climb onto the school bus, then out the back, where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as the Garner's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as though their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the newly paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking nonstop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone else in the family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich, Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the Barons had gotten rich when everybody else was poor, but Dad never said the word Baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women in form-fitting dresses, and heavy-set men in what Luke's dads and brothers called sissy clothes, shiny shoes and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them, showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family, that they never looked like any of the Barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them, and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were all as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they'd grabbed first out of the closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare show up with 3 kids, he always counted 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. What if a family with just one kid moved in behind them, and he sneaked into the house and pretended to be their second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke. Luke living with Barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing, or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him to read and do math as much as she knew herself. "At least I have a few books for you," she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He'd read all their books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. That's one of my favorites, actually. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He'd like to forget he was Luke Garner, 3rd child, hidden in the attic. Sometime around noon, he'd hear the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother there were no more made apple pie now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm report, and there's usually a song or two after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do a whole day's work a few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do homework afterwards, and they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the winds came down, the 3 of them often had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always thought about who got to have Luke on his team, because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys together could always be the 3rd. Now they played half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, but Luke could tell they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end, when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day, or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in chicken she'd degutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Mother," Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep, sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. "Mother," he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned that chicken all—" "Oh, sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Luke sat up. "That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for this anyway." He swallowed a lump in his throat. "Anyway, I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. "No," she said quietly. "Then I don't need it either." "Okay," she said. She kissed his forehead, anyhow, and then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left. Chapter 8. One cool, rainy morning, a few weeks later, Luke's family left in such a rush they barely had time to say goodbye. They dashed out the door after breakfast, Matthew and Mark complaining about their packed lunches, Dad calling back, "I'm going to that auction up at Shidlesville. Won't be home until supper." Mother hurried back and handed Luke a bag of cracklings and 3 pears and some biscuits from the night before. She muttered, "So you won't get hungry," and gave him a quick kiss on the head. Then she was gone too. Luke peeked around the stairway door, surveying the chaos of dirty pans and crumb-covered plates left in the kitchen. He knew not to look out as far as the window, but he did anyway. His heart gave a strange jump when he saw the window was covered. Someone must have pulled the shade the night before to try to keep the kitchen warm, and forgotten to raise it in the morning. Luke dared to lean out a little further. Yes, the shade was down on the other window too. For the first time in almost 6 months, he could step out into the kitchen and not worry about being seen. He could run, skip, jump, dance, even on the vast linoleum without fear. He could clean up the kitchen and surprise Mother. He could do anything. He put his right foot out, tentatively, not quite daring to put his full weight on it. The floor squeaked. He froze. Nothing happened, but he retreated anyway. He went back up the stairs, crawled along the second-floor hallway to avoid the windows, and climbed the stairs to the attic. He was so disgusted with himself, he could taste it. "I am a coward. I am a chicken. I deserve to be locked away in the attic forever," ran through his head. No, he countered himself. "I'm cautious. I'm making a plan." He climbed up onto the stool on top of a trunk that served as his perch for watching out the back fence. The neighborhood behind his house was fully occupied now. He knew all the families and had come up with names for most of them. The Big Car family had 4 expensive cars sitting in their driveway. The Gold family all had hair the color of sunshine. The Bird Brain family had set a row of 30 birdhouses along their backyard fence, even though Luke could have told them it was pointless to do that until spring. The house he could see best, right behind the Garner's backyard, was occupied by the Sports family. 2 teenage boys lived there, and their deck overflowed with soccer balls, baseball bats, tennis rackets, basketballs, hockey sticks, and apparatus from games Luke could only guess at. Today he wasn't interested in games. He was interested in seeing the families leave. He had noticed before that all of the houses were empty by 9 in the morning, with kids off to school and grown-ups off to work. 3 or 4 of the women didn't seem to have jobs, but they left too, returning late in the afternoon with shopping bags. Today he just had to make sure no one was staying home sick. The Gold family left first, 2 blonde heads in one car, 2 blonde heads in another. The Sports family was next, the boys carrying football pads and helmets, their mother teetering on high heels. Then there was a flurry of cars streaming from every driveway onto the still sparkling new streets. Luke counted each person, keeping track so carefully that he made scratches on the wall, and counted the scratches twice again at the end. Yes, 28 people gone. He was safe. Luke scrambled down from his chair, his head spinning with plans. First he'd clean up the kitchen, then he'd start some bread for supper. He'd never made bread before, but he'd watched Mother a million times. And maybe he'd pull the shades in the rest of the house and clean it thoroughly. He couldn't vacuum, that would be too loud, but he could dust and scrub and polish. Mother would be so pleased. Then, in the afternoon, before Matthew or Mark or the kids in the neighborhood got back, he could put something on for supper. Maybe potato soup. Why, he could do this every day. He'd never considered housework or cooking particularly thrilling before. Matthew and Mark always scoffed at it as woman's work, but it was better than nothing. And maybe, just maybe, if this worked, he could convince Dad to let him sneak out to the barn and help there too. Luke was so excited, he stepped into the kitchen without a second thought this time. Who cared if the floor creaked? No one was there to hear it. He gathered up dishes from the table and piled them into the sink, scrubbing everything with extraordinary zeal. He measured out flour and lard and milk and yeast and was putting it all in a bowl when it occurred to him it might be okay to turn on the radio, very, very softly. Nobody would hear, and if they did, they'd just figure the family had forgotten to turn it off, just as they'd forgotten to raise the shades. The bread was in the oven, and Luke was picking up lint by hand from the living room rug when he heard tires on the gravel driveway. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, too early for the school bus, or Mother or Dad. Luke sprinted for the stairs, hoping whoever it was would just go away. No luck. He heard the side door creaking open, then Dad exclaiming, "What the?" He was back early. That shouldn't matter, but hiding on the staircase, Luke suddenly felt like the radio was as loud as an entire orchestra. Like the smell of baking bread could fill 3 counties. "Luke," Dad yelled. He's gonna get it. Luke heard his father's hand on the doorknob. He opened the door. "I was just trying to help," Luke blubbered. "I was safe. You left the shades down." so I thought it was okay, and I made sure everyone was gone from the neighborhood, and Dad glared. You can't be sure, he snapped. People like that, they get deliveries all the time, get sick and come home from work. The maids come in during the day. Luke could have protested. No, the maids never come before the kids get home from school. But he didn't want to give himself away any more than he already had. The shades were down, he said. I didn't turn on the light. Even if there were 1,000 people back there, nobody would know I was here. Please, I've got to do something. Look, I'm cleaned up and... What if a government inspector or someone had stopped by here? Dad asked. I would have hidden, like always, Luke said. Dad was shaking his head. Leave them smelling bread, baking in an empty house? You don't seem to understand, he said. You can't take any chances. You can't, because... At that precise moment, the buzz on the oven went off, sounding as loud as a siren. Dad gave Luke a dirty look and stalked over to the oven. He pulled out the 2 bread pans and tossed them on the stove top. He flipped off the radio. I don't want you in the kitchen again, he said. You stay hidden. That's an order. He went out the door without looking back. Luke led up the stairs. He wanted to stop angrily, but he couldn't. No noise allowed. In his room, he hated. Too upset to read, too restless to do anything else. He kept hearing, you stay hidden. That's an order, echoing in his ears. But he'd been hidden. He'd been careful. To prove his point, to himself at least, he climbed back up on his perch by the back fence and looked out on the quiet neighborhood. All the driveways were empty. Nothing moved. Not even the flag on the Gold family flagpole or the spokes on the brain faced windmill. And then, in the corner of his eye, Luke caught a glimpse of something behind one window of more family's house. A child's face. In a house where 2 boys already lived. Dun, dun, dun. So that's more with chapter 9 through safe. Hope you're enjoying it. My favorite books again, a series of 7 different books. So if you're bored, once you're done this, you can move on next book. So stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you again, same bat time, same bat channel tomorrow. And same for Miss Howard's cooking at 10 today.